by placing sandpaper over the neck, taking a piece of particle board and rubbing it over the sandpaper while pushing down on the neck, I've created a channel in the particle board that matches the shape of the neck. So now when I remove this, I put sandpaper here, I can use this to dress the neck. As you can see, I've also put Blue Magic marker on all of the frets. When I'm making sure that the necks are level, what I want to do is sand just until there's a line of silver from one end to the other on each fret. No further. Once I've got that, I've got the maximum height that I can leave these frets at while having them completely level. I want to take off as little material as possible. Notice that every time I go from one end of the neck right past the other, and I try to keep the pressure very even as I go across the neck. Give that a quick vacuum so I can see what's going on. Still got some low spots in here and over here, so I've got a little more sanding to do. Every once in a while, I'll turn the paper 180 degrees just in case my channel in it isn't quite symmetrical. If I turn it 180 degrees, it makes sure that the arc is fairly symmetrical. I'm seeing silver continuously for most of the frets. I just want to make sure it's level along the length. So now I'm going to go full length strokes like this, keeping the pressure as even as I can. Turn it 180 degrees. Do it again. Okay. I'm going to take a straight edge and I'll have a look. See how it's looking. It looks fairly even. Just going to bring it down through this area a little bit, because you can always allow the bow to bring that back in, or use truss rod adjustments to bring it back out. I think that has it. So now we're on to the crowning. I'll just crown this one just because it's in the middle of the frame and we can see it. So I make sure that it's a nice easy angle for me to work on. I'm using the wide because that's what fits these frets. And I will just go from one end to the other smoothly, and then just leaving a little bit of blue in the middle. I'll do one side and also do it from the other side. It gives me a better chance of getting everything symmetrical when I do it to both sides. So I'm looking to see how much blue is left. It's a fairly even line. These are wide frets, so I'm not going to get this line too narrow. I'll do another dressing or two in each direction and then I'm good to go. So I'll do the other 20 frets and then we're on to polishing. Frets have all been dressed and crowned, so now I'm going to take a bit of 400 wet, and I'm just going to manually sand each fret. I'm just rounding back and forth as I'm doing it. So this is just the beginning of the polish process. I'll do the edges here, and I'll kind of let my thumb push into the frets to round them. And hopefully I won't have any sharp edges to deal with later on. Feel when the fret starts to get smoother. There's less friction on the sandpaper, and then I just move on to the next fret. So I'm pushing kind of from the sides of the fret rather than right on the top, because I don't want to take it down any. I just want to round it a little more. Okay. A very light polish of the top of everything. Looks pretty even. There's no dents or gouges anywhere in the frets. They should be fairly level. So I'm going to switch over to 000 steel wool to start to really polish them. Again, this is a pretty easy step, nothing really fancy. I just press down right over the fret. I go back and forth until I feel it smoothen out and I see the fret starts to change from a gray color to to a darker silver color, more of a stainless steel type color. At the end of every step, I vacuum. And I put a bit of rubbing compound on each fret. This is not the finest stuff we have, it's the second finest. But it will do the trick to get this to start to polish, and then we'll switch over to the finer compound. And start the buffing process. Doesn't take an awful lot, a little bit on each fret. But because it's going to get one side more than the other, I'm going to do it in both directions. I flip the neck around and I'm going to get it from the other direction to make sure I get the other side of the fret as well. Frets are done. Level, crowned, shiny. Everything you want from frets. Snap off here. And we'll see what we have. We have a fretboard and frets that probably look better than they ever did leaving the factory. So the frets are done, they're dressed, they're polished. You need to put a nut in. The nut is a little thicker than the groove is right now. The groove is probably fairly full of finish. There's a thinner nut. This came out of another guitar. It's the same width, and that's important because we're going to use this later on to start the grooves in this. So first things first, I'm going to get my jeweler's files out, and I'm going to start bringing this edge of this back this way. I'll straighten this edge, and that's it. I'm not going to take it this way at all, because if I do, I'll throw off the intonation. Now, my bigger file, which is just about the exact same width as my nut, will fit. It's just a little narrower than the nut. Notice I'm using these fingers to push that way at all times, so I'm only looking to remove just enough wood, wedge it in. That's a little too tight. I want a little bit of play so that as the neck expands and contracts, it doesn't crack it. So I'm not putting much down force, it's mostly force in this direction. So this slot is now filed enough that the nut slides easily. There's not an awful lot of play, just a little bit of wiggle room. Well, now I'm going to rough cut it to width. And I'm going to leave it a little bit oversized. I'm going to do the final fitting with a file. Nice snug fit, 90 degrees to the board. We're going to glue it in place. Carpenter's glue. I'm going to put some on the back of some scrap sandpaper. I'm going to use a dowel that's smaller than the slot. Just lay it down along the bottom of the slot here. We're using this type of glue rather than an epoxy or something very solid like that, because we do want this joint to be reversible. Also, if excess squeezes out, just a damp cloth will take this away. I'll put that in there, squeeze it down. I'm going to tighten this down while it dries. Verify it's still 90 degrees. It is 90 degrees. I do need to go a little that way, so just give it a light little tap. And we'll clamp it, and we'll leave that for a couple hours. We've got it clamped. Got a rag there to protect the finish. And we're going to leave this for a couple hours for that glue to dry. It doesn't take all that long. Take a suitable plunger and push out. I'm going to drill about halfway through. And then I'll flip it and I'll drill from the other side. Okay, so those should be now clean enough for the machine heads to work smoothly. I'm just going to press these in by hand, flip it over, washers and the nuts, nice straight piece of wood to align them, make sure that they're all parallel to each other, and they're nicely aligned. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my trusty Dremel, and I'm going to put a piece of tape on it. This tape will act as a depth gauge so I don't go too deep. Okay, that'll keep me from going through the wood. And I'm just going to drill those 6 holes. Now there's holes there. Put in the alignment screws. A little bit of wax from an old birthday candle helps the screws to go in more easily. A small screwdriver makes sure that I can't over torque them and snap the screw heads off. All the screws are in, so they won't rotate from these positions. I'll give a final snugging to the nut on the other side. Okay, so we wait for the glue to dry, and we're going to use this nut as a guide to notch the other nut. The friction pieces that were on these were no good. They're cracking, and I just happened to have an old set around that was the same diameter, and I changed those out, so now these all have nice appropriate amount of friction to them. So now we move on to the nut, and I've got the reference nut taped to the neck. I'm just going to put a little clamp on it here just to kind of reinforce that positioning to make sure it doesn't move. I take out my nut files. Use the grooves in the old nut as an alignment point, and I notch the new nut. Once it's notched, it's time to put the strings on. We have one last thing to do before we can start to shape this nut to its final shape. Strings are on, as you can see. And we've got the string tree. That needs to be lined up nicely, so the best way to do that is to let the strings line it up. And then I'm just going to make a little dent here, so I know where to drill. As before, I've got my gauge on there so I don't drill too deep. It's important to have the string tree in place before we do the final setup, because it actually affects how high the strings will be at the first fret. And that's a very important measurement when we start to do the setup of the nut.